Justin and Leigh, thanks so much for joining me on the Mark Divine Show. Super stoked to have you, and I'm really excited for this topic. So thanks for joining me from Justin in Santa Fe and Leigh up in Berkeley. Welcome to the
Thanks for
Mark Divine
having
Show.
us.
Good
Yeah,
to
Yeah.
it's
be
my
here, Mark.
pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I was pretty excited to see this kind of pop up into my radar because the topic is near and dear to my heart. I've been studying Zen since I was 21 years old, believe it or not. So you probably didn't expect that. Talking to a Navy SEAL, all of a sudden we jumped right out with that one. So the subject matter is interesting. And I too actually gave a presentation to Congress. I haven't trained Congress, but I gave a really interesting presentation, and we talked about the need for more mindfulness and more, you know, practices. Let's just say to bring a little bit um, collaboration to a new level. But haven't
Hmm.
seen any real action on that yet.
Right.
It takes a while. Those results
Yeah.
take a long time.
I think
Planting
the
seeds.
implementation and getting people to buy in probably takes even longer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, talk about tell us about how you guys came to collaborate. You're together in your business. Your partners in Astraea Strategy. Did I say that right? Astraea.
Yeah. Yeah. Astraea
Okay.
Strategies.
And so, what is the core focus of your work, and how did you tell us how you guys came to work together and to then ultimately collaborate on this book.
Hmm. I was coming from Capitol Hill, leaving that life behind, and looking to be engaged in the public policy process, thinking about how we make social change on issues that matter in a way that goes a little bit deeper than politics, in a way
Mm-hmm.
that takes into account people's real core values, the work of mindfulness, like I was teaching mindfulness on Capitol Hill. And that's really Leigh's specialty, how to go deep with people through coalition building and this kind of work.
Okay.
And she was a
Well, let's.
natural partner.
Okay, and so Leigh, what was your work before you guys came together? I mean, and how did you guys connect?
Yeah. Well, I convene and facilitate processes with cross-sector groups. So it might be people from government entities and
Hmm.
academics and business sector, as well as NGOs that are working together on a shared problem. So we've worked with a lot of people trying to get toxic chemicals out of our products and
Hmm.
worked with climate change teams in NASA doing multi-generational collaboration. Sounds a little similar to what you're trying to do just to foster that deep connection. And
Hmm.
so I was in the midst of that work, speaking with Justin about this, and in these long conversations we were having, he asked me if there's anything he could offer in return, and he had been doing a ton of writing. So he's written a lot of articles on
Hmm.
wellness, well-being, economics, all kinds of a huge range of things. And I said, how about we write something together? And he said, let's write something together. So we pitched an article to Harvard Business Review on silence. And I love that you said, you love this topic, you saw it right away and you resonated with it. I feel like that's how it hit us too, but we had no idea where this was going to go. And we certainly didn't necessarily think that the Harvard Business Review audience would take to it like they did, but it seemed to resonate. It became a widely shared article, one of their most shared in the last few years. And so we
Hmm.
took some steps back to think about what would it mean to write a book about silence
Hmm.
with these audiences in mind, these cross-sector trying to get things done in the world audiences in mind.
Yeah, and it's certainly um, we're at a point where I think many different kind of interest groups are ripe for looking at doing something different, something new. The pandemic certainly shocked people into awakening. There's
Absolutely.
more of a willingness to take things like mindfulness or practices from the contemplative traditions more seriously. And I'm so it's exciting, I think, to me. And it's curious to me, Justin, you said you did work in teaching people mindfulness on Capitol Hill. I remember, I think it was, is it Tim Ryan who was the mindfulness guy?
That's
He
right.
And
is.
I thought that was cool because he was also a CrossFitter, I think, right? And so, or I think I might be getting my guys mixed up, but
I think that was Paul Ryan.
that was Paul Ryan. Okay, so
Yeah,
I
Tim
got the
Ryan's a
last
little bit
names.
of a yogi. He calls
Yeah,
himself the Rust Belt Yogi sometimes. He's from Youngstown, Ohio, old
right on,
industrial town, and
right.
he got into mindfulness just because he needed to, the stress in his life.
I find it fascinating. He must be like a fish out of water on Capitol Hill. When I was there, and the perception is it's just this cacophony of people just screaming to be heard. And so I'm curious. like how many clients did you have? And what did this look like? Were you climbing a pretty steep hill when you
You
were
know,
there?
it happened in a few different ways. I was working for a member of Congress right out of grad school, and he and I both had an interest in meditation. And I started he asked me if I'd guide him in a little bit of meditation before he'd
Hmm.
go on TV a couple times. And it just became
Hmm.
a habit, a really nice way to connect and help him find some centeredness. Tim Ryan became a friend, and yeah, as you mentioned, he launched this mindfulness program, both with members and staff. There were different types of programs, brought all kinds of really good teachers from around the world in to teach. And I was the one staffer who was also a meditation teacher.
Hmm.
So I started doing some teaching, and I was really surprised, Mark, by how people took to it. It was really bipartisan. You know, we had folks there representing different parts of the country. We had senior policy staffers, some of whom were, West Coasters with good yoga practices. And others were, corporate attorneys who were, had gotten into mindfulness practice from working on Wall Street. And they were all there together, people with
Hmm.
different ideologies. I remember the first time I taught, it was in one of these, very official looking rooms in the Rayburn House office building, with the American flag and the fancy gold molding on the walls, and everybody's sitting there in their suits. And I just remember entering that room, and it was quiet after I gave some initial words and instruction, but the room felt so loud because everyone was in their head, like
Hmm.
thinking about the votes, thinking about their careers, thinking about, relationship
Yeah.
issues they were dealing with. And I just remember over those 20 minutes, there was a shift that happened. And I
Hmm.
mean, you don't have to believe in ESP or anything like that to recognize that when you're in a room full of people whose thoughts are really loud, you can
Right.
feel it. And when you're in a room of people who are concentrating and with the breath,
Hmm.
not so loud in their heads, you can feel that
That's
energy.
right.
And
Yeah.
I just remember that shift happening on Capitol Hill. And I remember thinking, like, hey, if this can happen here, maybe it can happen anywhere.
Right. That's fascinating, and I agree with that. It's an interesting distinction that silence isn't just the lack of noise, right? It's really
Mhm.
something different. It's a different quality altogether. In my company and what we teach in my program is a period of silence where we focus on the breath. We call it box breathing before every significant meeting. And it's kind of my dream and vision that you would see this become commonplace in the future because it's an incredible way to still the chatter and also to harmonize or synchronize,
Mm.
at a vibrational level, everyone who's coming together to solve whatever that problem is or to discuss a challenge. Is that, are there any discussions, Leigh, your guys are having like that, or are you literally at the level where you're just trying to get people to buy into the view that this is a good thing for them, maybe at a health level, which is where a lot of people start?
Hmm. We take many approaches, and definitely health is a big one. We're looking at how this
Hmm.
is on what the impact of noise is on our brains, on our bodies,
Hmm.
on our mood, on our relationships, on our what we intend to do with our time and our precious life here.
Hmm.
Kind of taking layers and layers and layers, and then the benefits of what as well of silence,
Hmm.
how it offers us that open space, that place to find, to really find and discern what is true for us. What is it we really want? What is it we really intend? To get that kind of clarity, like you said, it's more than the absence of noise. It's more than
Hmm.
just those things not happening, those bad things not happening. It opens up doors, different doors for each of us, I
Right.
think, that help us discern. And we really think of this book as a non-meditator's guide to getting
Right.
beyond the noise, because while it might be meditation that is one's way, your way, and has been our way. We're a bit of lapsed meditators at this stage right
Hmm.
now, just our life stage, with all we're raising kids and just the way our work worlds are built. But we're interested in the kind of silence, the kind of quiet we can find and feel and discern is really truly feeding us in that way. So
Right.
that might be dancing, it might be some pretty interesting like flow state
Hmm.
activities, it might be getting out into nature. We're interested in all this. It might be that box breathing, a simple practice that you can
Right.
drop into anywhere. But hopefully the reader through this process gets attuned to what is really bringing them quiet. what's
Hmm.
really bringing them that silence versus what maybe everyone
I
else is
think that's
doing. Yeah.
super valuable because my experience is that, or perspective is that even the term meditation has, it's lost all of its power. It's been kind of like bastardized in a sense. You know, it really is something that is a process and also is something that is very personal or personalizable. And yet wasn't really brought to this culture that way and nor taught that way in this culture. And so people really struggle with doing it because they think it's just one thing. You got to quiet your mind, or mindfulness is watch your thoughts, and they don't recognize that every situation might be slightly different. You might need a different tool for a different situation, and also every mind is different. And so,
Absolutely.
different processes or tools would be used to train a mind so they could even do basic fundamental, concentration training or mindful awareness training, or those types of things. So I love that you're kind of demystifying it and bringing more practical approaches so that people can stop thinking, oh, I don't meditate, or that meditation is not for me. Just take it off the table, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and another, that's it, Mark. And another piece of it is that often people who've tried meditation and don't do it, we just notice a tendency where they're beating themselves up these days and saying, oh, why
Mm-hmm.
aren't I meditating more? Or
Mm-hmm.
feeling like you were saying, like, they got to have the right cushion, they got to have the right app, the right practice. And what we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about here is just something that's so fundamental to being a human being, the
Mm-hmm.
capacity to tune into the space where nothing is making claims on our consciousness.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I often use the word stillness, which I think is synonymous with how you're using the term silence. One of
Mm.
our practices we call still water runs deep, which is a metaphor for the still water of a river that goes around a corner and let's say gets really deep, as opposed to the turbid, choppiness of the rapids. But
Mm.
clearly, we're looking for that still water that runs deep, which is really kind of more of a awakened awareness as opposed to being merged with your thoughts and identifying with those thoughts, and then you get caught up in that energy, and that can be very, over long term. That's where the hyper arousal comes from, because we're just caught up in these thoughts. We're constantly being triggered into that arousal state, and then that leads to long term health challenges because you don't have the off button. You don't have the de-arousal, response trained, right?
Right.
So it goes offline, actually.
And part of this that we explore in the book is that as a culture, we're trained to think that that arousal state you're talking about is productivity, is what's
Right.
right, what's good. We so often are trained to mistake stress for aliveness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Good
something
point.
built into,
Yeah.
how GDP is designed, for example. We measure the sound and stimulus we create, but we don't measure the value of the silence, the
Right.
value of the time in nature, the value of the time that's not caught up in the sound and stimulus. So one of the things
Right.
we explore is like, in this, I love what you're saying about stillness as synonymous with silence, because stillness is, it's an embodied thing.
Right.
When we tap into the stillness, we can feel this presence. One of
Right.
the things we wrote in that Harvard Business Review article we wrote a few years ago was that this is about being able to take a temporary break from one of life's most basic responsibilities, having to think of what to say.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like if we're
Right.
constantly in this space where we've got to be clever, we got to fill the
Mm-hmm.
space, we got to be entertaining, we got to own Twitter, whatever it might
Mm-hmm.
be.
Mm-hmm.
What does that do for the nervous system? And then
Mm-hmm.
in turn, when we look at what happens to the nervous system, what does that do to our capacity to find creative, generative ideas, solutions to the problems we're facing?
Right. Yeah, I agree. I love that you take a personal, interpersonal, economic, and societal look at this idea of silence, because they all do kind of interrelate, right? So the collective impact of a culture that doesn't embrace silence, or that is constantly busy, 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 task focused and hyper aroused, is pretty extreme
Mm-hmm.
and can lead to a lot of cultural diaspora. You know what I mean? And I think we've seen that with the Great Resignation and people hitting the wall and burnout. And And that was just because we added a little extra dose of stress called a pandemic, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you had these skills, if you had these skills of tapping into your inner nature in silence, then the pandemic was just another event that happened outside of you. You know, it didn't define your entire life and cause these major breakdowns. In fact, those people who had these skills thrived during this
Mm-hmm.
pandemic. And I think that right there is shows a contrast between, like, the skill of stillness versus the skill of not having uh, practice for stillness. One leads to thriving regardless of what's going on outside of you, and the other leads to you being kind of a slave to the environment and to
Mm-hmm.
the economy and to the what's going on in the world. The sense of control is external, right? External loci of control. That's a classic Stoic principle, but it's very true here in this concept, right, that we're talking about.
Yeah. We do actually, we're playing with that tension of the things that are beyond our control, outside of our sphere of control. But we're very interested in looking at systemic change, what
Mm-hmm.
policies, what regulations, what
Mm-hmm.
values we can collectively hold, what cultural aspects are where silence is being honored.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at that big picture thing, but also looking at what we can do as individuals in our lives. Where do we have a sphere of control? Where do we have a sphere of influence? We turn to a teacher, the primary teacher in this book, who demonstrates that as a man incarcerated on death row for a crime that the preponderance of evidence in our belief is that he did not commit. And so
Mm-hmm.
he's in a cell for 23 hours out of a 24-hour day, still finding a way to make his way to quiet, to quiet
Mm-hmm.
those thoughts, to deal with the cacophony of sound bouncing off those steel walls and the mesh
Mm-hmm.
wire and the constant hollering and the lo-fi radios and the party beats that are just going all the time. How does he find his quiet in there? Well, he does somehow. He finds his
Mm-hmm.
locus of control. He teaches us about that principle. But so there's an element of where we can take that control that we have, as well as the bigger systemic issues that we want to assure people is it's not like you're doing it wrong, that you cannot focus. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like you're messing up terribly. It's like the whole system is driving towards noise. We are addicted to noise as a society.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. What was going through my mind when you're talking about that, Lee, is back to this idea of noise versus stillness. So, I've also been inside a prison and talked to lifers, and I've too found it fascinating because the ones that I've talked to have been really, really peaceful and calm and pretty, well adjusted to the reality of their situation. Now, I don't think I've talked to someone necessarily on death row, but lifers, and and it got me thinking about, like, in a prison there's all these noises, in an office building like you said it's just noise constantly. And so when you meditate, you don't, you're not, or when you have a practice of stillness, you're not like disassociating or blocking out the noise, right? There's, you can practice desensitization. Pratyahara is the yogic term,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't mean you don't hear the noise. It just means you're not disturbed by it,
Right.
right? And in a sense, the noise is happening, and it's happening in some kind of distant place. You're aware of it, but you're not disturbed by it because you're not identifying with the aspect of your being, which is, the sensory body, right? So you're identifying with a much bigger aspect of your being, which is, the awakened awareness or conscious body, right? Or the causal body. And that's tough for a lot of people to wrap their non-metaphysical heads around. So how do you guys address that in
Yeah.
in your work?
I'll
We
just jump
actually,
in. Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Jarvis kind of does that for us because he says early on when he was engaging this desire to be quiet and sitting down to meditate, he is a accomplished Tibetan teacher at this point. He would say that early on it seemed like the men would get real loud just as he was sitting down to meditate. And how was that? How do they know I'm meditating right now?
Right,
But his teaching to us is that he had to learn how to quiet the noise by quieting his response to the noise, which is
right.
exactly what you're saying. So in case I hadn't said his name is Jarvis J. Masters, but he's the
Hmm.
one bringing us those. What would you add, Justin?
I was going to say the same exact thing. This teaching he brought us about
Mm-hmm.
quietening the noise by quietening the response to the noise. And like
Mm-hmm.
Mark, you were talking about this example of the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic was so strange because at some level it was like an easing of the noise of the world. I mean,
Right.
for once, traffic
Right.
declined. It got
All the
quiet
planes
enough for everybody
stopped. You know,
to
all the
breathe.
all the all the noise of the smog pollution. Do you remember that picture that ripped across the internet of the Himalayas being seen for the
Uh-huh.
first time from that
I
Indian city? I
saw
don't
that.
remember that.
Yeah,
I
and you
mean,
could
that
hear
was kind of
whale
the
songs for the first
right.
time.
I
Yeah,
know.
they were all this was happening, man. And it was like at the same time, it got so noisy in our heads. I mean, it
In our
got noisy
heads.
in our homes too, because all of a sudden our offices became our homes and our homes
Right.
tripled as schoolhouses for many of us. And then just all the uncertainty of the culture and politics, the uncertainty of work created
Right.
this level of internal noise. So in the book we look at different levels of noise. There's the auditory noise of the world, which is
Mm-hmm.
empirically louder than it's been, according to
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of different research organizations that we explore
Mm-hmm.
in the book. But it's no question that the informational noise is
Mm-hmm.
exponentially louder. We're just
Mm-hmm.
dealing with orders of magnitude more information than we ever have, which brings its benefits, but it
Mm-hmm.
also brings a lot of challenges in terms of where we hit our upper limits of our cognition and our ability to
Mm-hmm.
perceive. And it's really
Mm-hmm.
tough to measure a third level of noise, which is the internal noise, which,
Mm-hmm.
in talking to some of the world's greatest neuroscientists, we heard from many of them, neuroscientists, psychiatrists, psychologists working in academic institutions, that we have all these proxies of how loud it is inside the consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And according to some estimates now, Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan, who's an expert on this, says we have to listen to something like 320 State of the Union addresses worth of internal dialogue every single day.
I've
And
heard that,
yeah,
like 60 to 100,000, thought streams. I mean, it's, yeah.
so all this
Those
noise is
things,
on the
what
rise.
it's
Yeah.
fascinating. Like what you talked about earlier, like the different ways, Lee, you said that you can find to, just calm that stream down, right? So if you imagine like your mind as a river that's running between the banks of the body, right? It can be a raging river or it can be calm and still. And so one way to prove that point is to go out and camp in nature in an area with no cell phone coverage or internet coverage, right? And within 24 hours, right, everything just starts to slow and settle down. It's almost like the dirt that's all stirred up in a really choppy river representing your thoughts just starts to settle to the bottom because you're not being triggered constantly by whatever stimulus you're taking on.
Mm-hmm.
And so your thoughts will naturally settle down. You spend 5 days in nature, you're going to be even calmer. You spend a month in nature, even calmer, right? And I remember coming out of nature stints and back to kind of quote unquote reality and just being jarred with how freaking fast everything seems, how loud everything seems. So that's I'm certain that you discuss nature as a practice or a tool in the book. But what are some of the other ways, non-meditation, we'll use air
Yeah.
quotes around that we can find a little bit of silence?
Well, we turn to what we interview a professor of biobehavioral health and medicine, Dr. Joshua Smythe, out of Penn State, and he does these large-scale stress reduction studies, mindfulness studies as well. He's the one when we asked him what internal silence might be like. We wanted a definition. We were sort of cornering him for that. He said, quiet is what people think quiet is. And he
Mm-hmm.
told us about a participant in his study who found his inner peace, inner calm, by doing chainsaw carving of large hunks of
Mm,
wood. And
that's
he would
cool.
find a flow state there. This has pointed us towards all these flow states. So
Right.
we want to actually, like, rather than think that any of these are better than or whatever, what's best is what you'll do. What's best is what brings you quiet, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's best is where you find that maybe day-to-day snippets or pockets of quiet,
Mm-hmm.
or deep, more immersive, rapturous silence, whatever that is. So we do talk about things that could be like pausing and taking a breath, any point in the day, or
Mm-hmm.
just thinking about moments of transition a little differently,
Mm-hmm.
including like when you find yourself in a line, waiting for something, or in traffic, that too is an opportunity, not one you ordered up, but one you might take advantage of, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe not try to check your phone or listen to more podcasts. Forgive me for that,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
that kind of, so
No
just
worries.
kind of give yourself some quiet in
Right.
those moments. So, and then also how to do that together, because to not only think of this as a solo sport, but silence we find is magnified when it's shared. So how do we do that in our
Right.
office places?
Right.
How do we do that as families, with friend groups? How do we invite in some quiet, sharing quiet?
I love that. And you're right. It's magnified and also it's supported, right? So you're going to,
Yeah.
if you had a structure in an organization or your family or a combination where quiet time, and it could be a variety of practice, were both supported and structured in, baked into the schedule of what it is you do, then you're basically stacking practice time without
Mm-hmm.
having to really even think of it as practice time. You just, this is what we do. And I think there's a movement in organizations to, to bring, like, well, you guys are part of this movement, to bring these practices into organizations. For instance, this idea of a deliberately developmental organization is something that we're working with, trying to bring growth tools into organizations that include, you know, um, opportunities for team practice. Like I said, our team box breathing practice before every
Mm-hmm.
meeting, right, is one example. And another is similar to what you just described, Lee. We call them spot drills. The spot drill could be, at after every deep work session, you just take 5 minutes and you might walk around the building and do some deep breathing, or you might do 50 air squats, quietly by yourself in the bathroom stall, which I got from
I
Tim
love
Ferriss,
that.
stuff like that. And I just want to kind of cap this point off, by saying, ultimately, what I've learned through my meditation practice is that you want to basically take it into your life every day, right? It's not meant to be something where you tie yourself to a bench or a yoga mat for the rest of your life.
Right.
That's really preparatory work because you haven't built the awareness in to be able to take it with you wherever you go.
Right.
And
I
so if you
agree
could kind of
completely.
shortchange that by building structure that forces, in a sense, people to do these practices on the go or wherever they're at. And it could be, like you said, a variety of things. It could be iPhone apps. It could be practices that you do with your work group or your family, or whatever. Then you're stacking all that time of doing silent work, and finally, it takes time, but over a while, you're just changing the course of that river of your mind, and it slows down. You have moments where it just slows down, and you appreciate the stillness.
I
Once
love
you
that.
appreciate it, you never go back, right? Once you get the
Exactly.
experiential essence of it, you're like, oh,
You
I see what those
remember, I
guys were
think we
talking about.
remember, and some part of us, even if it's not in our own, we remember what this is like. And so then I
Right.
think it's hard to go back at least as fast.
Well, and Mark, I love that you just use that word appreciate, because I feel like that's the essence of so much of this. Like we could have all the tools and apps and practices in the world, but the most important thing is that we can recognize our lodestar, that we can
Mm-hmm.
recognize what's bringing us clarity and renewal.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this concept that keeps coming up for me as we're talking today. It's a Japanese aesthetic principle called ma.
Mm-hmm.
And ma in ancient Japan means empty space, negative space, but it also means pure potentiality. It's
Mm-hmm.
the silence in between words exchanged in
Mm-hmm.
conversation.
Right.
It's the silence, it's the negative space and flower arranging and all of
Mm-hmm.
this. And
I love
in
that. Yeah.
in notes and music, all of this. And it's like that appreciate, as you were talking about appreciate, Mark, like appreciating that pure potentiality in the space. If we
Mm-hmm.
cultivate this appreciation, then it doesn't really matter which practices we have. It doesn't really matter, if we're a skillful meditator or not, because we know where we could turn our consciousness moment to moment. And like you were
Right.
asking before about practices day to day and how to do this, we have a little section of the book called Momentary Ma, where we look at the practice
Mm-hmm.
of just as you're leaving a room, taking a
Mm-hmm.
moment before turning the doorknob, before grabbing a glass of water, whatever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
to take some breaths. And it doesn't need to be a fancy breath work practice, but just tune into the silence Let all the
Mhm.
thought and worry that need to generate sound and content, let that go and appreciate the silence. We talk about
Yeah.
Ma on the job, and we even in the end of the book talk about Ma goes to Washington and what it would look like in public policy.
My goes to Washington. The concept is difficult for most people to understand, um, because they haven't, everyone basically misidentifies themselves with their thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
or the combination of thoughts, their physical body, and the sensations or emotions, right? And so they think, okay, this thing that shows up here is Mark or Lee or Justin is me.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't identify with what you call the negative space or the backdrop that allows me to even be aware of me, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there is no such thing as an absence of me when you turn around and connect to pure awareness, which is the stillness that exists, or the source that exists, that me came out of, or that me, this body mind arose out of. Right? It's different. It's, that when you talk about non-duality, the average individual, you have no connection to what that means, and so you try to identify it with duality terms,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's very confusing, and so you really can't go there, like when you're teaching this. And I think metaphors obviously help, like what you just said. Like, one of the reasons we appreciate music is because of the silence, right?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you wouldn't know it as music, right? Sound has to have something that exists before, after, and during sound. What is that? Same thing with the human being. The mind has to have something that exists before, during, and after the mind, for the mind even to be able to recognize itself. And I think ultimately that's why meditation is confusing and painful for a lot of people, because ultimately it really was just a mechanism to get somebody to slow down and to do some mental training that got them away from their thoughts. Then the rest of the work was, let go of all the efforting, because the more you effort, the farther you get away from it, right? And so that's the challenge. People kept efforting because we have a bias toward action in
Mm-hmm.
the West,
Yeah.
and it's not. It's a surrender to just be that leads you to that golden silence.
And one of the
I feel
things
like
we
I just gave a
explore.
mini lecture. I really apologize for that.
No, that was
No,
it.
not at
That was
all.
it,
You
Mark. I
nailed it.
mean, I feel like we're at a time, and this has been bubbling up, since the start of our conversation. We're in a moment of history when people are recognizing that the old ways of working aren't
Ain't
working.
working. Right?
It
Mm-hmm.
ain't working.
Yep.
Ain't working.
So we look, for example, at at Pythagoras, 2,500 years ago. This very esoteric ancient Greek philosopher came up with some of the geometric theorems that are still in eighth grade
Mm-hmm.
math textbooks. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this guy was a generative genius if there ever was one. And he required that his inner circle of students spend 5 years in silence if they wanted to
Unbelievable.
study him. So we look at this
Unbelievable.
question like,
Yeah.
imagine you're going to spend 5 years in silence.
Yeah.
Don't, take on this thought experiment, or really this feeling experiment for a moment. Imagine you don't have to, think of any of the responsibilities you need to take care of over those 5 years. Everything's taken care of. Imagine what 5 years in silence would do to the architecture of your mind.
Yeah. I
And
can't
tune into
imagine
why
that. That's
Pythagoras did
intense.
it. Yeah.
I
Yeah. What do you think,
my
Mark?
my SEALFIT program, is a leadership program couched in, military special operations, kind of physical mental toughness training. And this is a fun story. And my training center, when I had it in Encinitas before, the city kind of ran us out of town because we were doing things that just didn't fit into their paradigm, like running down the street with human bodies over our shoulder,
They didn't like
CrossFit
that?
style stuff. They didn't
They
like
didn't
that. They
like
didn't,
that?
interestingly enough.
Wow.
And I think the reason was we were right next door to the Self Realization Fellowship, which is Paramahansa Yogananda's organization. Fantastic organization. And one day I had just given a lecture in our gym/classroom, and on the board I had the word silence in the middle of the board circled with about three or four other concepts. And I was teaching class on leadership, and I was we were having dinner upstairs, and I look down and I see this Indian guy, not Native American, but an Indian, standing in the middle of my gym, staring at this board. I was like, "Oh, this is going to be good." So I go downstairs and introduce myself, and he's like, "Wow, I was just so intrigued. I came by here and I see that this is SEAL Fit, and you're doing kind of special ops kind of fitness training." But then I see this word silence, and it was like this, you know, incongruent moment, and I just kind of came in. And so, anyways, the reason for this story is that he was a software engineer. Imagine that, from India, right? Super successful software engineer who was a self realization devotee. And he had just given his interest in his business to his partner, and he was heading back to India for a 3-year, 3-month, 3-day silent retreat.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
that's part of their culture, right? They go, this turning in phase of their life. They basically walk away from all material attachments and go through an intense period of silent introspection, to prepare for the final stage of, you know, like the last 20, 25 years where they're going to really turn in and be more spiritual, I guess.
Mm.
So I can't imagine, back to your point, Justin, what it would be like for a 3-year silent retreat. I think it would be challenging for most Americans to do that, or Westerners. And nor am I advocating it, because I think the, you know, there's significant benefit to learning how to do this in the midst of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this is the challenge we see with monasteries and people who, disappear from society, right? Thinking that they've got to get away from the noise, but they just drag the noise inside their head and all their dramas with them. But in everyday life, you're getting instant feedback, right? You're not in some pretend environment. And I would say even in prison, it's a manufactured, or it's an environment. It's very real for those individuals. But let me put it this way: it's just much more difficult, but much more rewarding if you can attain stillness as a householder. What the yogis would
Mm-hmm.
call a householder. I don't know if I had a point there, but I just think it's fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a big tension for us because we're with you. I mean, we decided not to write a book on silence for people who want to run away to
Right.
monasteries.
Yeah.
I've got 2-year-old twins and a 5-year-old and a, consulting practice, and Leigh is a teenager out in Berkeley. And, we're not recommending that people do as Pythagoras' inner circle did,
Right.
because we need people in the game. We need
That's
people
right.
to
That's what I was going to
engage.
say. It's all hands
Mm-hmm.
on deck, right?
It's
In
all
Right.
hands
service
on
to,
deck.
yeah.
That's right. So how do we, given that this is an all hands on deck moment in history, how do we deal with the imbalance in the world right now of the just extreme surplus of noise that we're dealing with?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the big question for us, is how do we do that? And we keep coming back to, this word you used before, appreciating silence. We talked with Judson Brewer, who's a psychiatrist and neuroscientist at Brown University, who's one of the foremost experts in the neuroscience of mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And he told us something really interesting. He said from decades of fMRI studies of meditators, both novice and experienced meditators, when he looks at the meaning of silence in the mind and the meaning of noise in the mind, it's always the same thing. Noise in the mind is a state of contraction,
Mm-hmm.
contraction in the body, contraction in the mind and thinking. And silence is a state, a felt experience of expansion.
Mm-hmm.
But as Judd was telling us, most people mistake that state of contraction for a feeling of success and productivity and aliveness.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we want
Mm-hmm.
that dopamine hit, but we
Right.
might not know what a more spacious kind of fulfillment. And like Aristotle, for example, talked of eudaimonia,
Mm-hmm.
and Gandhi talked, for example, of how when the thoughts and the speech and the actions are aligned,
Mm-hmm.
like we don't have these touch points, we don't have these reference points of what a deeper kind of fulfillment, a quieter kind of fulfillment, a more sustainable kind of fulfillment feels like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. The only place you really see it is in studies of people who are near the end of their life, right? And you don't
Mm-hmm.
ever hear of anyone saying, "I wish I had accomplished more or done more or spent more time on the road," and or if I built one more organization. Never. You
Mm-hmm.
always hear the opposite. I wish I'd spend more time in quiet, or spend more time in nature, or spend more time with my family, or been a better listener. Right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's going to be a challenge to transform it. I think it'll be a generational type thing, right? Because we have such an intense bias in our culture toward action, toward doing, toward staunch individuality building. And it's served well in a certain sense for technological advancement, but it's led to a lot of challenges. And so I'm kind of curious before we wrap up, like what are some of you address economic costs of not embracing silence, and so what are some of the cultural or economic or structural costs, and what do you see, kind of how do you measure progress against those costs,
Mm.
or in solving some of those challenges?
Hmm. Yeah, it's an important question. There's been a lot of work to measure the cost at the level of the health consequences of so much auditory noise, but
Right.
we're only just beginning to understand what the consequences of all the information overload looks like. Florence
Mm-hmm.
Nightingale, 150 years ago during the Crimean War, was serving the British Army in a hospital outside Istanbul, where she recognized noise as one of the biggest hindrances to healing.
Interesting.
She saw that the noise was driving the fight or flight response in the nervous system, which was in turn driving both, difficulty healing at a physical level and also driving conditions that we would call PTSD today. So
Mm-hmm.
we're getting more and more of a sense of what that actually looks like, of what those costs actually look like. And it's tough to quantify sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned before this idea that we measure GDP according to not just how much industrial stuff we're creating, but how much sound and stimulus we're creating, how much mental
Mm-hmm.
stuff we're creating. But then again, it's like, how do you measure the value of silence? How do you measure the value of, like, all those conditions you were talking about, Mark, a person on their deathbed,
Mm-hmm.
recognizing the value of that time in nature or the time with family?
Yeah.
It's hard to put a price on something that's priceless. And
Yeah,
that's
wouldn't it be
why,
nice if,
yeah,
sorry, if
no, go ahead.
GDP was gross domestic peace?
Yeah, I like
That's a
that.
good way to think of it.
A new
Exactly.
Yeah.
measure.
So we do look in the book at some ways we could rethink GDP, not in a totally radical way. It's not a particularly ideological thing, but for example, in the economy right now, we measure consumer price index, which is in the news a
Mm-hmm.
lot with inflation, or we measure the money supply, not as one indicator, but as a series of different indicators. There's
Mm-hmm.
different uses of those economic indicators, so there's different types of CPI or different types of money supply. So why don't we measure GDP as a series of different indicators, standard GDP, and then also accounting, for example, for traffic time or pollution. Usually
Mm-hmm.
as GDP goes up, crime could be increasing because that often increases with the cost of the need to buy new stuff or locks on the
Mm-hmm.
doors or traffic. So why not, work to compute that? And then working our way up to something that looks more like what you're talking about, gross domestic peace, or something
Mm-hmm.
like Bhutan has, gross national
Mm-hmm.
happiness,
Right.
where we have a series of different indicators. So we're looking in the
Right.
book at different ways we could take this, yes, the personal practice in that sphere of control, what we could do in a day-to-day moment, but then
Mm-hmm.
also looking at this at the level of what we can actually do as a society, so we get out of some of these dynamics. Leigh, what would you add to
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
that?
I'm thinking about Tyson Yunkaporta. We spoke with author and maker of traditional Aboriginal tools, who pointed us towards the fact this noise is actually impacting everybody on the globe, including and maybe especially some of the more remote tribes in the Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
that it's really permeating everywhere. And that maybe this is not so much about solving it for this generation, but
Mm-hmm.
remembering and setting it up for future generations.
Mm-hmm.
So in this end, and that he was very, he said, I know that sounds horrible and maybe depressing, but this is an exciting time to be alive,
Mm-hmm.
to
I agree.
remember that, to be in the role of remembering. And that's part of what we see is just honoring the importance of silence in our lives, to mark time, to share those important moments, to celebrate this life that we have, to take note, to not again take that lightly. But we came to this urge to write this book because we had a sense that there's got to be more than just
Mm-hmm.
this more thinking, more talking, more thinking, more
Mm-hmm.
talking. It was definitely reaching its end, and that the losses more than that nuisance of sound or of noise. It's more than that. It's really the quality of our lives with the people we love and the work we love and the time we want to be spending.
Right. I
It's
love
it's
that.
urgent. It's
It is
important.
urgent.
Yeah.
I'm reminded. I had a deep meditation experience recently, and replete with some visions, and it was cool. And at the end of
Mm-hmm.
it, I just kept hearing "Remember who you are," and I had already been practicing um, the 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 practice that Ramana Maharshi really kind of popularized, which came out of the Nanath or the Nath yogi tradition of just investigating the concept, who am I, right? And so who am I, asking that question and just penetrating into the depths of what that means is the same as remembering who you are. It's the same
Mm-hmm.
concept. And it's the who you are beyond the concepts, beyond the chatter, beyond the noise, beyond the identifications. It's like we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like you said, it's the work that you guys are doing and that others are doing in this space is to help our culture remember who they are, because we're talking about humanity, and the more you remember who you are as an individual, then the more you connect with the humanity of the whole,
Yeah.
right? And so this doesn't just lead to more health, at an individual level or organizational success because people are more productive because they're less stress. It leads to a global population coming together and turning their back on violence, turning their back on disconnection, and reconnecting. And
That's
I think that's
exactly it.
profound. You know.
That's exactly it.
And that was, Mark, that feeling you asked before about teaching mindfulness on Capitol Hill. It's not like it's a panacea getting people in that room together to meditate. It's not going to solve all the problems we face these days, but it's a prerequisite
Right.
that we can all get beyond the noise. You might have seen that when you were there, or for
Mm-hmm.
that matter, when you were in the prison. Like
Mm-hmm.
unless we could get beyond this identification, like you were saying with Ramana Maharshi, this identification that we are our thoughts, we are the thoughts that we produce, we are the sound and stimulus we produce. Unless we can
Mm-hmm.
get beyond that delusion that leads toward the utter pollution of the world with so much point and counterpoint and entertainment and
Mm-hmm.
sound and
Mm-hmm.
stimulus, unless we could get beyond that, how are we really going to hear the signals of what's true, what we really need to hear?
Right. Well said.
Mm.
Well, I've got to wrap this up because I'm going for a while here. The book is golden, and is it published yet? Is it out
It
in this?
is. Yeah,
Okay,
in the US, it came out May 17th. In the
excellent.
UK, that's HarperCollins. And in the UK, May 5th with Penguin.
Okay,
Yeah, Golden, The
but
Power
two
of
different
Silence in a
publishers,
World of.
unless Penguin is owned by Harper's. Is that? Or?
Yeah, well, that's just the foreign rights went to Penguin in the UK, and 13
Interesting.
other countries have it lined up at
Okay,
some point to translate. So it'll get out there. But yeah,
excellent.
it's readily available.
And where can people find more information about you guys, about your company, and about the work you're doing?
You can find us at astraeastrategies.com. That's ASTREA strategies.com. We both have independent websites as well. Justin Zorn, Leigh Marz.
Mm-hmm.
And the book can be found wherever you buy books.
Wherever, which is
Yeah,
pretty easy to find these days.
yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your time. Thank you for the work you're doing and for this important contribution to creating more stillness and silence in the world. And thanks for
Mm.
the show. Appreciate it.